Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Thursday, January 1st, 2026. Happy New Year to all who observe. And today we have a special mashup episode. Mike put together a bit of a best of collection of some of the segments we've done on onion production, from starting seeds to planting onion seedlings, interplanting, and pulling onions early. With how many different subjects we cover in a year on this show, we felt like it's good to occasionally, collect them into something more cohesive, a single subject in this case. So I hope you enjoy, and happy January, happy New Year. We are over a quarter of the way into this century, if you can believe it. And of course, happy onion growing. I'm starting mine next week, in fact. So let's do it. So today I want to talk about growing onions from seeds because that's what's on my mind. Well, onions and shallots. In the first segment, we're going to talk about starting onions from seeds. And in the third segment, we'll discuss planting and fertilizing onions. So I prefer onions from seeds rather than sets or plants because I have the space, a greenhouse, to grow them from seeds, and it's cheaper for us. That said, buying bulk onion plants, if you can find the varieties that you want, is still generally pretty cost effective, though of course that assumes you've priced it out and that you can find organics plants, which isn't always possible. Sets, which are just tiny bulbs, are a little more expensive, and in my experience, we've had more issues with bolting from sets than from seeds or from plants. But also, I haven't done it enough times to know if it's just the varieties I've chosen for the sets, or perhaps the time of year, or how I planted them or something. Onions are biennials, so they will bolt if they think they went through a winter, a spring, and then a winter again. Thus, the reason I don't recommend sets generally, as they are onions that have already done one part of that cycle. Though some sets are treated in a way that reduces that bolting, but anyway, I like focusing on seeds. For seeds, not every onion variety is right for your region. Onion bulbing is triggered by day length, meaning that the number of hours you get in a day will determine which bulbing onions you can grow. So for instance, in the southern United States, where summer days are not as long as they are, say, up north, you want to stick to what are referred to as short day onions. Vidalias are an example of that. Short day onions are often planted in the fall, though they could also be started in a greenhouse in the winter, and then they are harvested when they bulb up in the summer. Now, most onion variety descriptions will say what latitudes they are adapted to, so knowing what latitude you're in will help you determine what varieties you should grow. As we move further north, we get into day neutral or intermediate day onion territory. This is where you start to see a lot of storage onions and even some shallots, which tend to be longer day. Not to brag, but my area on the 38th parallel has quite a few onion options, and I love it. We can even grow the famous sweet Walla Wallas here, but those are ones I recommend having a CSA or market already established for before you grow them because they don't store super well. Delicious as all get out, just not super great for storage. I love growing candy onions, which are our Walla Walla type, but even here in mid-January, we are still eating out of our storage area of candy onions, so they store perhaps better than some of the other Walla Walla types. At least in my experience. Now, the further north you get some more storage varieties and more shallots. That said, you can fudge these things just a little bit. We grow Matador shallot, for instance, here in the 38th parallel, but it's adapted for the 40th parallel and above. They grow fine for us. We get pretty good bulbs, but I wouldn't push that maybe too hard, or you're likely going to get smaller and smaller bulbs as you get further and further away from that adaptation area. I like to start onions after the winter solstice, so typically in January, but if you can start them earlier, that's fine too, as long as you can keep them protected from getting too cold. I just don't want to have to protect and water them over the Christmas break. Also, some customers don't mind smaller onions. We shoot for a medium to medium large onion by planting 2 to 3 seeds per cell, covering them lightly with soil mix. Then, if there are too many in a cell, we will cull them and use them for fresh onion bunches, like after they've grown out a little bit. In other words, I'll still plant like a 5 or 6 set onion because I drop onion seeds sometimes. If there are 5 or 6 onions in that block, I will just start pulling 2 or 3 of them as they mature and then just selling those as like green or fresh onions, effectively waiting for the others to bulb up. In the third segment, though, there is where I will talk more about onion planting. In terms of growth, I will add a little fish hydrolysate after a few weeks just to ensure they grow to full maturity. in the greenhouse, which is around 6 to 8 inches in length or 15 to 20 centimeters. And then we plant them in March. Nothing super complicated. Onions like to germinate in the mid 60s to mid 80s Fahrenheit or 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. So a heat pad is ideal, or a germination chamber if you have one, or your house, whatever makes sense for you. Just get them back into sunlight ASAP once they germ so you don't get super leggy onions. Yeah, all right. We will talk about planting and why trimming onions is not necessary after a quick question from our Patreon members, BRB.
Today's episode is brought to you by FarmRaise. Still struggling with your balance sheet? Your lender's asking for a balance sheet and you're stuck with a spreadsheet mess or guessing your numbers? FarmRaise Tracks takes the stress out of farm finance. With one click, you can generate an accurate, up-to-date balance sheet that shows your assets, liabilities, and equity. No accounting degree required. You'll be ready for loan applications, tax season, or just a clearer picture of where your farm stands. Join thousands of farmers using Tracks to build stronger businesses. Get 20% off with code NOTIL20 at farmraise.com for the lifetime of your membership. All right, back to the show.
If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I try to get to questions from everywhere the questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Jesse Hammond. I love how many Jessies we have in our Patreon now. That's shouts to Jessies. Anyway, Jesse asks, quote, "What are your thoughts on interplanting onions with garlic?" End quote. Okay, so this is a fun question because garlic and onions seem like perfect plants to interplant with other crops, but unfortunately, they aren't really, or at least not really in bulb form. To explain, alliums are not very competitive crops, generally speaking. As I talk about in the Living Soil Handbook, every plant has what is called a critical period of competition, meaning that when the plant has an abundance of competition, either from weeds or other crops, at a certain point in its life, then it will have a physiological response that for onions tends to be grow really tall and not put your energy into creating a bulb. I remember that my buddy and one of my great mentors, Jeff Poppin, you would know as the Barefoot Farmer, used to grow the best onions. And when I asked him what the trick was, what he did differently than what I was doing, he said, no weeds ever. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I remember the way that he explained it sounds like he keeps his onion beds absolutely immaculate, especially in comparison to anything else he grows. And part of that is no doubt the moisture. Weeds will keep moisture around onion bulbs, which could lead to disease. But part of that is also the competition factor, the bulb size. The weeds will simply encourage the plants to put its energy into leaves and not bulbs. And the same thing goes for garlic. Those plants cannot tell the difference between a weed and a crop you desire. So in terms of garlic and onions, if a bulb is the goal, I don't recommend a direct interplanting. However, the critical period of competition response can be used to your advantage in the case of, say, green onions, also called scallions, where a tall green part of the onion may be the desired outcome. When our growing space was more limited, we used to plant green onions in between our lettuce, transplanting both of them at the exact same time. This meant we could double the crops out of those beds in this, basically using the same amount of space, like not spacing our lettuce any differently. It was a little complicated for harvesting and it was a lot of work up front, but the onions were nice and tall and slightly blanched. I am not a big fan of companion planting in general, meaning planting something just to help the other crop and not necessarily as a crop itself. But alliums have been shown to have positive effects on diseases and pests in crops like strawberries when planted together. Again, if you do plant them with something like strawberries, don't expect much of a bulb from the onion, but you can get green onions or green garlic, plus the obvious ecological bonus of protection from the allium. Most other crops are not quite the sensitive divas that alliums are, and may even benefit from that little bit of shade from sunshine scattering on the tall onion leaves like we discussed earlier this week in the shade episode. Shade being another reason I like interplanting. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Maybe more on critical period of weed control or critical period of competition later. Otherwise, let's do one last quick break, and when we come back, we'll get polycultured. Sure. Be right back.
Today's episode is brought to you by High Mowing Organic Seeds.
High Mowing Organic Seeds is celebrating their 30th anniversary with 47 fabulous new varieties for 2026. Highlights include downy mildew-resistant cucumbers, a poppy that looks like cotton candy, and 12 new tomato varieties. High Mowing offers more than 750 varieties of certified organic, non-GMO vegetables, flowers, herbs, and cover crops, all trialed for optimal performance in organic growing systems. High Mowing has the professional quality seeds and supportive grower reps to get you from seed to harvest. Visit highmowingseeds.com to request a catalog and use code 26NOTILL, all one word, 26NOTILL, for 10% off your order of $100 or more. That's highmowingseeds.com. All right, back to the show. Today's Patreon question comes to us from Patreon member Andy Novak at Mother Farm, who asks, quote, "Hi, Jesse. I have some bulb onions that I didn't keep up on weeding, and I'm worried they won't size up well in the weeks leading up to harvest. Can I pull the small ones and sell them as green onion bunches to salvage some value? Thanks," end quote. Okay, so I did, just so you know, answer this whenever it came in so as not to leave Andy hanging. But let's talk about this idea a bit of pulling onions out of bunches or out of beds to help other onions size up, because this can in some ways be not just a rescue strategy, but a way to, in fact, get a bonus crop in some instances. First, digging onions out of weeds is the worst, so I feel you there. Like I mentioned earlier this year, I had a small section that ended up weedy after all the rain that we got, and I didn't really have time to get to it, so the onions sized up okay, but they were still a pain to harvest, and I'm sure I lost both yield and, well, onions in that section. Now, weeds will certainly reduce yield, but it doesn't depend a bit on the weed and the stage of the onion when the weed kind of pokes through. For instance, if the onion started the bulbing process already before the weeds really started to take over, it's possible you could still get a decent yield, and it may be worth waiting or just trying to pull some of the weeds. Now, with certain weeds, that wouldn't be possible because you will be pulling up the onions at the same time with all the root mass, but that could be an option later rather than pulling the onions early. However, yes, it is an option to pull the onions early and bunch them with some of the greens on and sell them as fresh onions. I tend to use the term fresh onions rather than green onions because I use the term green onions to refer to what most people call scallions. But each area and farmer can use the terms that they think serve them best. In fact, it was a strategy of ours when we were doing farmers markets to pull onions early that we could tell we're not going to size up significantly because they were in a cluster of onions or were just smaller when they were planted. And then we would bunch those together in 3s or 4s and sell those bunches with the greens trimmed but still on. We sold them at one bunch for $3 or two bunches for $5. So you were almost getting like $1 an onion. And that would free up some space with other onions and give us an early product out of those beds. We didn't quite sell enough that way to justify an entire bed specifically dedicated to those sort of small bunching onions. But I could see getting to the point where you could produce significant quantities of onions that way and make it relatively profitable. And like I said, each bunch selling for $2.50 or $3. So for a 250 square foot bed, that's roughly $1,000 or more depending on the spacing. So if you did or do have to pull them early and you're clever about the marketing, you can actually bring in almost more revenue that way in some instances, because with cured onions, it's harder to sell them at close to $1 a piece in many markets, and you had to wait longer to get them out. So they were in the bed longer, taking up your growing space. One challenge, though, is cleaning these onions, which can take a lifetime and reduce the profitability. So I would recommend cleaning off some of the skin in the field and finishing them in under the sprayer at the wash pack shed to be the most efficient. I have long thought there's a place for sort of an air compressor that doesn't use oil to effectively blow the skins off. So you're not like just sitting there individually peeling the outer layer of the onion off, which makes them more presentable and make them sell better. In fact, I had not talked about this in a couple of years, but just yesterday, our friends at Sage Hill Ranch Gardens tagged No-Till Growers on Instagram with a post using a leaf blower to clean the onions up a bit. And I love that. That's great. That could be a really cool option for just doing a lot of onions really fast. Anyway, I hope that's helpful for you all and your garden planning, and for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere getting ready to start rocking and rolling on those gardens down there and your onions. Let me know any thoughts you have on this and all the things. Anyway, be right back. Today's episode is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud supporter of Growers Daily. At Johnny's, they do more than sell seeds. They grow them. They trial them to see how they perform on Johnny's research farm in Maine and across the U.S. and Canada. Only the best varieties are added to their catalog and website. When you need proven varieties you can count on and detailed guidance from seedling to harvest, consider Johnny's your trusted growing partner. JohnnySeeds.com. That's JohnnySeeds.com. All right, back to the show. All right, so yes, continuing on with our onion focus, at some point in time, you will have to plant your onion seedlings. So we should probably talk about how to get them in the ground. Again, we grow our seedlings out to about 6 to 8 inches or 15 to 20 centimeters before planting. But that's somewhat arbitrary because we will usually just get them in the ground in mid-March regardless of what size they're at. But usually we want them at roughly that height if we can. Now, basically, everyone on the internet will tell you to trim the onions before planting them to create bigger bulbs. But as I discussed in the onions video I did a year or two ago, which I will link in the show notes, that's not really true. It's one of those pervasive garden myths that floats around and everyone believes because it's been around for so long. And to be fair, I actually believed this idea as well for a really long time because it's just like a thing people say. But eventually I was like, wait, is that accurate? Because I do that with basically everything. So the science says that a long time ago, a lot of the bigger onion growers were struggling with planting onions because onion leaves and roots tend to tangle together, making it difficult to separate them. These growers wanted to know if trimming the tops would harm their onion yields. So researchers looked into it, and the answer that they found was somewhat nuanced, but more or less, yes, it will probably hurt your yields a bit, but the economics may bear out in the labor it saves you. So if it will help you to get your onions in the ground faster, then you can trim, but you may just lose a little yield and likely just lose more onions to disease. And then they give examples of like, if you trim it at this many days, you'll lose X percentage of your yield, whatever. Then someone presumably saw larger growers trimming their onion tops and assumed it boosted yields, and the idea took off. So no, you will not likely get bigger bulbs by trimming onions. It probably will be the opposite. You may just get more disease and maybe nothing at all. So it's not a necessary step, but it may also untangle your onions, so it could be helpful for some of you. Also, another thing people say is that trimming them will keep them from laying on the ground, and I can't find any research on that specifically because it's such a specific thing. And I've certainly never seen our onions start to flop over in the garden, but there is some research that says planting your onions on their sides will reduce yield. So if they are falling over, well, I still wouldn't trim them, but I definitely would make sure that they're planted straight up and down. And I would probably plant them just a little bit deeper to ensure that. As for bed prep, make sure the soil is weed-free and draining well. I always apply a small amount of good fertilizing compost just to ensure the onions get off to the right on the right foot. But onions tend to be relatively low maintenance nutrient-wise. Some studies have demonstrated that continuing organic fertilization will increase bulb size, but also potentially risk greater levels of disease. In fact, a conventional 2022 study from the Great Lakes found, quote, synthetic fertilizers and insecticide inputs can be reduced substantially without compromising onion bulb yields, and this should lead to greater profits and a reduction of chemicals in the environment, end quote. So effectively, people have been adding fertilizers like kind of throughout the life of the onions, and what we're learning is that may actually decrease yields. So interesting finding. Could be entirely contextual. Hard to say. So anyway, I like the initial compost application and then just keeping the beds clean. The weed-free part is important. Weeds will beat up on any crop, but especially onions. Not only can they scarf down nutrients and water, but also keep dew on and around the onion plants, increasing disease susceptibility. This is, like I've mentioned before, not a crop that I interplant for that reason. I space my soil blocks with, again, 1 to 3 plants per block on a roughly 8-inch by 8-inch grid with 6 rows on a 48-inch bed. Or if we're going to do that in metric, that's 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters on the grid on a 122 centimeter bed. Now, I say roughly 8 inches because I mark the beds with a gritter from Never Seen Farm, and the gritter is more like 7.75 inches by 7.75 inches. But as you can see, that gets a little bit wordy. So 8 by 8 is fine. You get the idea. Push each block into the soil enough so that the block is completely covered, because if you don't do that when you're planting, they'll dry out. But I try not to cover the bulbs too much. It doesn't seem to really hurt them, but it's not necessary for me. I just want the block to not dry out. That's all I'm worried about. If you're going to irrigate them, drip is preferred. Keeping the leaves dry is ideal for disease management. I know that I've mentioned disease here several times, and to be honest, we've never really had any issues with disease or pests in our onions, which we're thankful for, knock on wood. I don't know if this thing is real wood, but I'm sure someone is thinking, well, healthy soil will help protect your plants from disease, which is true, but don't push it. Wet leaves are a playground for disease, so no need to risk keeping them wet with overhead irrigation if you don't have to. All right. I think for planting and starting onion seeds, we've got that covered. We are still quite a ways out from needing to harvest and cure them, so I will save that for its own segments closer to that time and wrap it up there. Patreon members, make sure to get your questions in. Also, anyone is welcome to go hang out over at the No-Till Growers Forum and converse with all the nerds over there. And it's free and open to the public, and you don't have to log into Facebook to see it, which I think is a huge bonus, personally. All right, I hope you enjoyed our little onion off, and that will round out this Thursday. Don't forget, No-Till Growers is officially a nonprofit 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. We just got one from Dog Cow Farmstead, so shouts to you all. You can learn more about how to do that in the show notes. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out as well. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors, and if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at notillgrowers.com. That's a good way to support this work of keeping this information free and open to anyone and everyone. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and also my wife Hannah for absolutely everything in the world. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a hat or a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at notillgrowers.com to support our work. A big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in this month of January, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Jane at Panine Potager, and Colin Ince. That's a fun name. All right, so as you will remember from Tuesday, Ridge and his mother Linz were now part of a new collaborative that they'd helped start, all single moms farming in Central Florida. That was, for as new as it was, thriving, or at least looking like it could. The children were happy. Ridge was absolutely in heaven and loved having all these new kids around, and the weather and the bugs, save for the mosquitoes, of course, and the lizards and all the wild birds. But then one day, Ridge is out with some of the other kids in the orange groves, and he looks up and spots a group coming towards them. In the center of that group, a startling face. It was the leader of the cult that they had left there in Wales, and he looked mad. Ridge immediately told the kids to run, and everyone sprinted into the groves. The group of men all split up, and each chasing their own child. The leader of the cult himself pursued Ridge, and Ridge, of course, did his best to get away from the man, but the man caught up with him and grabbed him by his shirt and hoisted Ridge into the air. "Where is your mother?" the man seethed. And that is for tomorrow on the Citrus City Showdown. I'm going to stick with that one. Thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you then for Friday, for Feedback Friday. You can put some feedback on this episode or the live episode yesterday, whatever you want to do. Happy New Year. Bye.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.